I want you to think about your teachers and the people that were the significant adults in your education process, excluding your parents, excluding family members, excluding the grandparents. I want you to zero in. Can you remember one?
Mm-hmm.
If it's a plus experience, give me a thumbs up. If it's a minus experience, give me a thumbs up. Okay.
I mean, it's mixed.
Okay.
It's mixed.
Is there? Okay. Those of you who may have your thumbs down, can you think of a teacher that gave you a message that was a plus experience? It doesn't have to be early. It can be later. Is there an educator or a teacher in your life that gave you a plus message?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your professors during your doctorate.
No.
There were no pluses in that?
Not towards the end, no.
Okay.
Sorry.
Would you share the experience, the message, the teacher that came to mind initially?
In K-12, you mean, in the beginning?
Well, you said, you put your thumb down that
Yeah.
there was somebody you thought of that gave you a message. This is a message telling you could or couldn't do something, should or shouldn't do something, etc.
Well, K-12, I was very much an invisible student. So
Okay,
I didn't really, I was neither a blue board nor a buzzard.
I got you.
And I was not a behavior problem either.
I
So I
understand.
just disappeared into the cracks K-12.
Okay.
So I didn't really, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, like, trying to think, but I didn't really have anything.
Remember that phrase, she was invisible student.
I didn't really.
That's a message in
No
itself.
problems.
Yep.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Never
Remember that, because we've got a whole book full of research on people
But I
that
think
fell into
too,
that category.
when you were talking about students and what they bring, from family too and expectations. So I was very much invisible at home because I was the middle kid of 7. So then obviously I brought that to school.
So the birth order stuff comes in there too, yes, okay. All right, now, some of you who had positive experiences. Could I get just a couple? I just wanted examples. And what I want to do here is I want to be able to see, okay, somebody's perceptions and expectations manifested themselves like this. They said or did this to me, and it had this influence on my achievement or not.
I
An
remember
example.
in primary school, at the end of the term, we have a big assembly.
Mhm.
And this assembly, each teacher stands up to say something about their classes, their class and their students. The students they thought were going nowhere, and students they thought were going somewhere. And this is publicly done.
Wow.
Going somewhere, some going nowhere.
And so, for me, what encouraged me was when the teacher said, "You are capable." And I had to look that word in the dictionary to find out what that meant, because I had no clue what it meant. And then they write positive comments that you have a future.
Yes.
And so when they read that, and my parents were because it's a parents' day too. So that made me feel like next time I have to do better, because I wanted now to remain on that column where I was one of the students expected to do well.
Right.
And I can see
That's a
my
perfect
friends who
example.
are
Yeah.
given the negative message publicly, say, these students have no chance.
Right.
And their parents are sitting
Well, and the
there.
person that was saying that was the one in the position to be
Yes,
saying
that's
that.
right.
Exactly.
That's the thing. Right. Moses, thank you for sharing that. How about somebody from the state? Yeah, we had thumbs up back here. How about somebody from the state?
Well, I grew up in the...
Tell me your name.
Vicky.
Hi, Vicki, and
Nice
let
to
us
meet
know
you.
who you are and what you do. a little
Culturally,
bit.
linguistically diverse education and early childhood and special ed, School of Ed.
Terrific. Thank you for being here.
Yes,
Appreciate
I'm
it.
happy to be here. Grew up in the 70s in San Francisco Bay Area, lots of hippie teachers, no walls on the classrooms, everybody doing their thing. And the Vietnam series is on right now with Ken Burns, and my
Right,
husband and I
right.
were talking about, I had POW bracelets, we
right.
were doing the thing. And the philosophy was every student is successful at their level. So it was this big love fest of, where are you, Vicki? Go get your packet of the stuff that you're on. So I always thought I was at the top of the class, whether I was or not.
Right.
Mr. Hack, love him, hippie, made us all feel like we were at the top of the class. Whether we really were or not, we believed it because that was kind of the era. Remember those no walls times in the 70s?
Oh, yeah.
Totally.
That drove some people crazy.
Yes. And I think that even carried on into my teaching style later on of, everyone is yay, So it was really a powerful academic identity that
Yes.
was granted me
Yes.
at a very early age.
Yes.
So it was interesting.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you. Vicki, I've asked people to, I think I've got it, but I ask you just to put the name you like to be called. I hope it's Vicki. Preferably your own. And so that we can all see it. Okay, what I'd like for you to do, you get the idea on this, and as you explore your perception wheel a little bit, this is one activity that gets really interesting. You'll notice from your agenda, by the way, I've given you the page numbers that correlate to the book as far as the sections that we're on. And the section on perceptions is on pages 15 to 18. I'd like for you to turn back to page 125 in your appendix.
Dee, can I ask a question? Where did you say that the page numbers?
On the agenda, the yellow agenda.
Oh,
The yellow agenda. So that it's a topical agenda and it gives you the page numbers of which section of the book we're dealing with. Okay, on page 125.
25, yes.
Okay, you see, what I've given you there are the things that we have posed, and we've changed this activity. What I do online with them is, because I've done this so much around the country, these are the categories that tend to be the most common, that people fall into, or that people talk about influencing their perceptions. So education, family, home, environment. They're alphabetical, by the way. They're not in order of importance. Geographical location, media. Media, by the way, adolescents across the country overwhelmingly say this is the #1 influence on their perceptions. That's where they get their messages about what people are like and what they can and can't do. Good luck. And that includes the World Wide Web and all of that. And then religion, church, spiritual beliefs. If I have a particular affiliation, that influences my perceptions. It influences other people's perceptions about me as well. And if I don't, the same is true. So you can take this both ways on some of this. Who I spend my time with influence my perceptions about the world and about things. Would you agree with that? Like my friends, my associates, my co-workers, etc. And then you'll notice the last one is personal characteristics. And you see I have on the board personal characteristics. Lots of times these are the main ones that teachers have immediate access to and form impressions and perceptions about students on the spur of the moment. And these are some of the things, instead of us taking the time, the activity that I do usually, and again, I told you we're going to abbreviate, we're not going to do all of these activities. The activity that I ask people then to focus their energy specifically on physical or personal characteristics, and what physical or personal characteristics tend to influence your perceptions about other people and about yourself as well, because that, we get into our own self-criticism stuff. And you'll notice at the bottom of page 125 that the ones that come up the most frequently are things that have to do with height and weight, whether I'm short or tall or fat or skinny, etc. People get messages about that. Gender, the whole issue of sexuality, being male or female. Do you think if I'm male or female, it influences how I perceive things?
Yeah.
You think that makes a difference?
Yeah.
The whole issue of sexual identity, this is coming more and more and more to the front, and people are dealing with it much more significantly as far as perceptions of themselves and other people's perceptions of them. Age. I made a comment earlier today, I'm older than dirt. Anybody kind of flinch at that? We do little self-deprecating things, you know? No, because we knew it, Dee. Oh, no.
Or we identify with it.
I always heard that when people laugh in situations like this, they're not laughing at you, they're laughing with you, that the people who laugh the loudest identify the most. So I find myself laughing in a lot of those kinds of things as well. Anyhow, that and the fact that you've known me forever, Jan, so anyhow. But the whole age thing, do you think, you asked immediately, when I said who's influenced or what's influenced, you said early childhood or middle, or sure, because it changes as we move through life. That's part of it. Okay. The whole area of race, ethnicity, culture, etc. And you'll notice that what we've done here, we know that race is a social construct, you know, but we also know that the whole issue of skin color is something that biological characteristics, mostly when we use that terminology, it's tied to skin color, it's tied to bone structure, it's tied to hair texture, it's tied to something genetically based, if you will. And when you talk about ethnicity, you're talking about that plus the whole nationality thing, your origin. And then the culture is all of that plus the traditions, et cetera, that are tied with specific groups, et cetera. So would you say that any of that influences people's perceptions about each other?
Absolutely.
Well, of course, all of our work is about that, about people's perceptions of it. Big one, the whole issue of language. Not only, again, what one's primary language is, or dominance, but if I'm multilingual, it's interesting. We kind of cross these, and I have to say this, over the years, one of the things that we noticed and that people were willing to share was that if I identified as white and I was multilingual, people immediately associated that with intelligence. I was perceived as a smarter person. If I was a person of color from another country and was not multilingual, that was also tied to intelligence. I was seen as not being as intelligent. And traditionally in this country, in our educational system, we had policies that tracked students that fit into that category into special education. And we have a whole history of people who work with students with a variety of needs, and I think all of them have special needs, you know. But we found that that particular area of study has had to go back and really take a look at screening processes and that history. And unfortunately, those kinds of, quote, solutions to problems still come up. People still decide this is the best place for this student or this is the best place for this student. So that's one area. The other thing that gets tied to intelligence has to do with dialects. And if you think about geographical locations and you think about dialects, I mean, in this country, if English is your #1 language, depending on if you drop your R's, you're assumed to be from, you know, if you park the car in Harvard Yard, you're assumed to be in the New England. If you flatten out your eyes and you slow down, hey, I was born in Illinois, but I grew up in North Carolina. And if I get tired or the more relaxed I get with you, those things flatten out. But I moved to North Carolina from Illinois, and I couldn't understand all these strange people. And I used to stand in front of my mirror and go, I, my, fine, line. Nobody told me. I just got it. That people didn't think I was as smart if I sounded like that. Wow. In my doctoral program, I had a doctoral professor, a dean of the doctoral program, who had 4 PhDs. She was from Mississippi. I said, don't you think maybe you've kind of overcompensated? 4 of them, you know. But think about it. Think about what we do with dialects. And we we do the whole thing, and we think, if we speak English as a dominant, that we're the only one. It's not true. There are dialects within every language. And people tie it to socioeconomic class, they tie it to intelligence, they tie it to all kinds of things. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, all of this comes into play on it. Body language and posture, how a student walks into a class, how they carry themselves across the campus, etc. Socioeconomics, the whole SES factor, socioeconomic status. Big as far as perceptions. And again, a lot of these cross. Some students, there are multiple factors that are coming into play on. Physical appearance. Hygiene. The grooming, the body art, the tattoos, the piercings, etc. We've grown with the times, as you can see. But think about people will give young people suggestions, you know, you can do that here, but you can't do it in the workplace, you can't do that. One of the things, language, you know, we've gone through all of this stuff about the communication, schools of communication have kind of changed, and they no longer call it like, they don't put a value on it, like standard or what. They talk about using language, using certain language in formal settings and certain language in informal settings. And so informal is when you're kicking back with your friends and you're at home or you're doing this stuff. And the formal is when you're applying for a job and when you're writing a professional paper and that kind of stuff. Because there's been so much about whether one is devaluing a culture by not accepting, you know, language that's of a certain standard, quote unquote. So when you think about that with the grooming and the body art and stuff, I have a hunch that as the generations who did not grow up with all of the tattoos and the piercings, etc., move into the great beyond, some of this is not going to be as significant. It's not as significant as far as influencing people's perceptions for younger ones. For people in some of our age groups, it had a tendency to indicate that one got drunk and did something in a foreign country, usually in the military, you know, and that was, or that it was the result of some wild night, you know. That's certainly not the case anymore. Any comments or responses or reactions to any of this? Does it ring true for you? That these are things that tend to influence people's perceptions? And remember, what's significant for us is that it does tend to get involved with those perceptions that tie into expectations, that tie into how we treat people, and it does tie into whether they're successful or not. And many times, people have barriers thrown in front of them because of some of this stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with their ability or their intellectual.
Yeah, I think when we, coming from way back, when I look at the tattoos, the way the tattoos, the moment I saw the tattoos the first time, I thought it was a very gross thing and only certain groups of people, like you were talking about the 60s and hippies,
Yeah.
that those would be the people who would be having those types of body
Yes.
size. But now it has become so often, I mean, it's so common that you cannot judge somebody based on how they dress or how they look, because when I saw a professor with tattoos, then it took my mind away.
Yes.
So again, something we learn with the time, just making those adjustments as we go along.
What I want to do is draw your attention to page 126 and 127, and basically, well, actually, not 127, just 126. And you'll notice that actually this didn't come from the online. I did some webinars, some online webinars, and we did these polls, and you can see some of the percentages of what people considered. I would ask them to pick the 3 most important, you know, and they gave us some responses. I'm going to give you a chance to look through that. And how many of you have heard the term implicit bias? Okay, all my equity people have heard it.
Yeah, well, I've heard it. Okay.
Well, I can tell you that it is a phrase that is becoming better known in the general population, and it's one that you're going to want to become aware of. The whole area of implicit bias, or kind of ingrained bias, if you will, it's unconscious, it's not intentional, quote unquote, it's not about talking about bad people. It's just when you are surrounded by the kinds of things that we've just gone through, with the kinds of messages that are out there tied to all of these various characteristics, it is virtually impossible to live in today's world and not have some bias going on in there. Now, when you scan the first 11 pages, you may have noticed in one portion of it at the beginning, we had the word bias and discrimination. And we made a distinction between the two. Because lots of times, people will use those words kind of interchangeably. But just for the benefit of those of you who aren't, quote, specializing in equity, I'll tell you that for the most part, when we talk about bias, equity professionals are talking about attitudes. We're talking about things that tend to be less tangible, that are not real obvious, that you don't necessarily count. We're talking about things that are not necessarily illegal. There's not necessarily a mandate or a policy or a law against it. And as I said, more often than not, it manifests itself through like feelings and attitudes, side comments, in informal settings. It's gotten more obvious, gotten into more formal settings more recently. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And anyhow, when you're talking about it, the key distinction between these two has to do with legality and illegality. And for the most part, equity professionals say that bias are the kinds of habits and attitudes that create an environment in which discrimination can happen. And discrimination, as most of you know, is a more powerful word, and it smacks of, I'm sorry, bias is not necessarily illegal. Discrimination, however, is illegal in most instances. When you talk about something being discriminatory, you're talking about it being against a policy, a law, a mandate, etc., that's in place. And for the most part, when you deal with some of the categories and some of the issues that we just talked about, when you deal with the categories of race and ethnicity, of gender and sexual identity, of developmental and physical disability, of socioeconomic class, etc., the reason most of those are in what we call protected classes. It means there are some laws or some mandates, etc., in place, most of which were rooted in civil rights work in this country and social justice work. There is a reason why the laws, the policies, etc., are in place, and unfortunately, it has nothing to do with the kindness in people's hearts. Most laws, policies, mandates come into place because, first of all, somebody gets angry enough and mad enough to become visible, to bring it to the forefront, and then eventually the way it gets to the courts is how? How do the complaints get to the courts?
OCR.
Lawsuits, absolutely, lawsuits. We have curriculum guidelines in the state of California that include multicultural, etc. not because it was wonderful for the kids, but because a family in Los Angeles filed a lawsuit because their kids were not represented in the materials, in the books.
Good for those
And that was in the 70s. And it was a family named Garcia. And so California has multicultural, inclusive curriculum guidelines, etc., again, because of the lawsuit. The same thing has happened all over the country on a number of situations. And basically what happens is the response to the lawsuits tend to be, besides settlement or payoff or whatever, compensation, usually written into them, is that the demand that something be put on the books that does not happen to people that are coming behind. And so that's when we get the laws. And we have a whole history of the civil rights legislation, et cetera. And I'm sitting with sophisticated, intelligent people that know a part of that. I'm not going to go back through all of it. But when we use bias, basically we're not talking about the stuff that's illegal, but when we use discrimination, we are talking about things that, you know, there's something on the books that says you can't do that. And lots of times people don't realize that that's part of what's happening. Ironically, the things that seem to be causing more and more problems these days, that people will identify them as discriminatory, but it's a result of things that people say or do, like in the workplace or in the school system, et cetera. So it comes to the forefront as bias. And that's why people are putting much more focus on this whole issue called implicit bias. And the colleagues at Harvard University have done a whole series. They have the implicit association test that's online that you can go to www.harvard.edu. I've got it in the book there.
Project Implicit.
Project Implicit, exactly. And a social psychologist named Banaji and her crew did the initial work on that, but it has absolutely exploded, and millions of people all over the world have taken these implicit bias tests. And you can go online and take a bias test on any characteristic you can think of, on any population you could think of, and populations within populations. And it's just a really interesting experience. And here's some of the main findings that you need to know over the years that we've discovered about that. First of all, as that says up there, many biases are unconscious. People aren't even aware of them. I mean, these are things that are so subtle that they haven't made the front lobe yet. So
That's so commonplace.
for what we're doing in here and the kind of work that we've been doing, what we find is that there's a disconnect between what teachers think they're doing and what's actually happening in the classroom. When you talk about people being treated differently, when you talk about teachers having different expectations for their students, the immediate response is, oh no, I treat all my students the same. Oh no, well, what we know from years and years and years of classroom observations, thousands of them, in every kind of situation you can imagine, is that that simply isn't true. Again, we're not talking about bad people. We're talking about not bringing it to the forefront, people simply not being aware. So the implicit association test is something that you can sit in the privacy of your own little cubicle and on your computer and or at home and run through. Most people who do not think they are biased toward others are biased. And people need not get upset at that statement anymore. As I said, we've just spent a whole amount of time talking about all the kinds of impressions and messages that are out there. Now, the implicit association test does not measure actions. It measures attitudes. It measures bias. Remember? People can consciously override their biases. In other words, I can sit and think stuff all day. But if I don't act on it, then it's not going to have the impact on the students that we've been talking about earlier. If I change how I act, I can override some of that stuff. There's an old line in the recovery community that says, You won't think your way into right action, but you'll act your way into right thinking. And basically, that's what happens with this stuff. So, what we've done with GESA is that we identified very specific behaviors that teachers use in certain ways with students from whom they expect the most. And what we've asked them to do is to practice those behaviors in the same positive, supportive way with all of their students, acting as if they think they're all going to succeed. And magic happens. And that's the key. That's the simple key. Acting as if we expect them all to achieve and practicing. But see, what we did, remember that wheat from the chaff I talked about earlier? We separated out and said, these are the things. And as I said earlier, these strategies that were identified early on have evolved into some of the things that are included in the best practices, which is why all of you who never heard anything about GESA have heard of these strategies. I mean, you know, because we've all been working in the same area. I believe in the collective consciousness. And so there's some things that have evolved that we know.
So basically what you are saying is that even if I believe this student has no chance of success, I still need to say you have a chance.
If I act as if that student has a chance at success, amazingly, sometimes they succeed. And amazingly, more often than not, they succeed. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying check your stuff at the door, folks, and let's go act as if we really believe this, you know?
They're all going to Princeton.
Yeah.
What?
That they're all going to Princeton.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay, the other area that you're going to want to be familiar with is the whole area of stereotype threat. And this is a body of research that, again, some of my colleagues at Harvard and other areas, Claude Steele and Jay Aronson and that whole group of researchers. And what I encourage you to do is, you know, go online and Google these folks and like Benanji, et cetera, and see what they've done recently, keep up with them, because they started and they've done some real landmark work and some breakthrough work as far as giving us some vocabulary, some concepts, et cetera, that people get, okay? And Claude Steele and Jay Aronson were some of the earlier ones. Claude actually coined this phrase, stereotype threat. And when you think about, again, what we talked about this morning about all the perceptions, et cetera, according to the research by Steele and Aronson, in a stereotype structured society, which we live in, and which many countries have, but America is a stereotype structured society, any way you look at it. Gender and race bias, and what we've done is be able to show that other categories of bias as well, but their research was done specifically on gender and race. Gender and race bias creates misleading expectations of student performance in the minds of both students and instructors. So what they're saying is that those perceptions we talked about, sometimes they're distorted perceptions. The messages that we've been taught aren't necessarily real messages. They're not necessarily rooted in fact. And sometimes we have to take them out and look at them, discard them, you know, again, tied to what Loretta said about at what point in my life, basically, you know, because we know that sometimes those change.
So Steele is
Yes.
whistling Vivaldi, right?
Pardon me?
Is Claude still whistling Vivaldi? That's his latest book?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
That's a
You
good
got
book.
it. You got it.
That's a good book.
That's okay.
Whistling Vivaldi, and it's about stereotype
Exactly.
threat.
Yeah, it's building, it's building on the work he's done.
It's
Yes.
good, yeah.
Yeah, we're still evolving, right? Yeah. And we are. Which is why we're all still here, right?
Well,
Okay. Thank
the
goodness.
premise of that book is that when you see a big black male on the other side of the street, a lot of times people go across the street.
Right.
But if he's whistling Vivaldi, because that, you know, that.
Oh, whistling Vivaldi, okay.
Yes,
Yes.
that you're more
Yes.
apt now not to cross the street.
Right,
You
right.
don't perceive them as
Whistling
Whistling Vivaldi,
Yeah,
I
yeah, and
gotcha.
it's
Okay.
a quick read. It's a good
Thank
book.
you.
It's a good book.
Thank you for mentioning.
Whistling
Whistling
Vivaldi.
Vivaldi, you know, the classical
composer.
Classical composer.
Oh,
Yes,
oh.
whistling
Wrote the
Vivaldi.
seasons.
So this big,
Yes.
this
among others.
large African male
If he's
is
walking down the
whistling,
street doing
but he's
quadratic
whistling.
equations also, you
Yes,
probably.
same thing. Yeah, it's a good one.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good, thank you for mentioning that.
Uh-huh.
Okay. The second thing that's come out of this work is that a student's belief in society's stereotype leads to what Steele calls disidentification. In other words, the students take on these messages too. Not only about other people, but about themselves. The anxiety students experience when aware of negative stereotypes regarding their group's perceived intelligence can greatly and measurably contribute to poor achievement. And that anxiety is part of what he's calling stereotype threat. Many marginalized groups have to constantly cope with the possibility that others will judge them negatively based on stereotypes. And you hear people all the time say, we have to work twice as hard to get half as much. You know, I mean, it's that kind of thing. This can become internalized and contribute to lack of participation and poor achievement. Lots of times students will act to type. You know, you can see students act differently depending on where they are. At one point in my career, I was an administrator in East Los Angeles area, and I had 29 police blotter identified gangs in a 25-mile radius, and I also had an on-campus behavioral intervention center, which was really an on-campus suspension center that they had to work and stuff, you know, and this was early on back when, okay, we're talking the 70s. And I had young men there that I knew they were tough as nails, and when they would turn the corner to go into their house, off would come the scarf, down would come the sleeves, and they'd go in and like fix dinner for their 5 brothers and younger brothers and sisters and stuff, you know. And you would watch, and this still happens, it's not the 70s, this is today. You see young people put on the armor that's expected of them, you know? They act tough, to do this, to do that, you know. And it's simply a matter of they bought into the stereotype, or they use that stereotype because they know that's what other people think, as well as feeding into fear sometimes. So, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of this work that Steele has done really gives us some insights into how these stereotypes have really manifested themselves and how they, you know, again, it's not just the adults, it's the students as well, because they take them on and use them with each other. So, what we found is, again, these are the categories that tend to be subjected to most discriminatory kinds of messages, that the biases tend to end up being forms of discrimination that get played out in all kinds of things, job, etc. Now, what I want you to do, and again, we're just going to take a couple of minutes to do this. What I want you to do, and you can do it at the table, you can do it as a table group, you can do it as partners. I want you to just think about some of the messages that impact the students that you work with. What are some messages that may be tied to some of this or something else that interfere with your students being successful? Does any of this, do you see any examples of this? And if so, kind of share with each other, and then we'll maybe share. Well, you've hit a couple of really significant areas, and one of the things I didn't highlight this morning when we were talking about the perceptions was that whole area, that whole issue of geographical location and the fact that, you know, where students come from. And I don't care where I am in the country or in other countries, if there's a road or a river or a railroad or a valley or something, and students come from north or south or, you know, this particular residential area or that, there's always some kind of perception and the messages that are attached to that. Well, we're going to move into some of the what to do about, as far as once we get them there. Now, you've got a whole other level of marketing to get back to attract the students. But as far as dealing with the students themselves, I wanted to go in a little bit into detail with you in the first unit on instructional participation and engagement. And then what I'm going to do is have you work in some dyads on units 2, 3, 4, and 5. We're going to do a little group activity. We'll take this up probably until about our lunch break. And then I believe our lunch is in the same room that the breakfast stuff was in this morning. We're not permitted to have any food or beverages in here unless it's a beverage with a lid. Right, Jackie? And for those of you who are off camera, I'm talking to the person that's running me today. And thank you, Jackie.
We'll feed her too.
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, we'll feed you too,
And
Jackie.
anybody else.
Right. So you'll notice that on your agenda that on page 21 in the book, we start with instructional contact. And what I'm going to do is just give you some of the main points of this area of disparity that we've identified. And a couple of you have already expressed an area of identification that we'll come into. Attention, participation, and engagement in one's own learning correlates to achievement. So one of the main things that came out of all of this work when we looked at who was being dealt in and who's being dealt out and what we call the squeaky wheels versus the quote invisible students, which we already had that term used earlier today. We found that one of the things that has persisted over the years, and I'm sure that you see it in the educational research that you read and deal with, is the importance of having people involved in their own learning process. As I said earlier, it's one of the reasons I don't just stand and yak at you the whole time. I want you to be involved in the information, the material, et cetera, yourselves a little bit. And you know that that's important for the students. It's important to identify what we call the frequency distribution of instructional patterns in the classroom. And that is simply, who's being involved? And what are the characteristics of the students that are being involved? And sometimes people think, oh, well, do we really need to do this? Is this really important? I mean, again, I treat them all the same. Well,
No, you don't.
We can't really solve a problem until we recognize that there is a problem. And so it's important to pay attention specifically. And this is as simple. I'm going to go through the observation process quickly in a few minutes. And it's, we have some suggestions that we have found really work effectively and quickly with teachers over the years. But we're just talking hash marks. We're talking sitting in the back of a classroom and just doing hash marks on who's involved and who isn't. And it's amazing sometimes the kind of results that you get. Note the 25%, 75% traditional reactive patterns. Well, if you take a look at the material and you read that section on instructional contact and instructional participation, what you're going to find is that in our traditional classrooms, and I like to point out that, now I know, when I used to say all of us, I realize now that many of you came along far behind me. But the truth of the matter is these things didn't change enough, but you escaped this. So most of you, I would venture to say, came out of classrooms that had these kinds of stats in them. And the stats were that it was not uncommon for 1 or 2 students to occupy up to 75% of all of the interaction and engagement and participation that was going on. Now, it varied depending on the age group, it varied depending on the situation. It was also not uncommon for a minimum of 25% of the class to not have any interaction. And those are those invisible students that have identified this morning. They don't cause problems, and if you don't cause a problem, that in itself, sometimes okay. And so the idea, I mean, when we looked at this initially, we saw these disparate reactive patterns. that's when we realized, as I said earlier, that if you leave it up to the students, if the students are the stimulus to your behavior, students know where the hot spots are. They know who the squeaky wheels are. They know how to get lost there if they don't, how to deal themselves out, etc. Or they know how to initiate. And some will approach the teacher, some wouldn't dare go near the teacher, so unless the teacher does something to encourage that. Yes, go ahead, Francis.
And that statistic is quite relevant when it comes down to disciplinary problems. Because
Absolutely.
if you only have your eyes on one or two students, and you're devoting that much time, they're the other 28 to 30 kids that you're not looking at, and out of that 28, you're gonna have some discipline problems.
Yes.
That you're not paying attention to, and then you're wondering, why are they not paying attention to what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Because they figured you out as well.
You're not paying attention to them.
That's right.
I want you, if you don't mind, would you read that? If you look on page 23, yeah. The paragraph on the bottom left, Kathy, would you read that?
Consistently, studies and practice have proven that attention is directly correlated to achievement. Traditionally, in a typical classroom or group in the United States, fewer than 5 salient people take a minimum of 25% and as much as 75% of instructional time and attention by calling out, raising their hand, demanding attention in some assertive way, and being obviously engaged in the learning process. Traditionally, more often than not, the person was male and white, European American. Their dominant language was English, and they were neither developmentally or physically disabled, and more often than not, the person came from a perceived high or upper middle socioeconomic background relative to the group. This person represented less than 15% of the total population, but was the target of the most traditional educational attention and was perceived to be the standard or mythical norm.
Thank you. And then we go on and talk a little bit more on that next slide. Loretta, how about reading that next section?
Traditionally, in the same classroom or group, a minimum of 25% and up to 75% of the participants received no instructional contact or attention from the teacher, nor were they engaged or participating in the learning process in any active, observable way. This was the case whether the teacher was a male or female, whether the teacher was at the elementary, secondary, or post-secondary level, and whether the instructor was in math, English, and social studies. Clearly in our society, the squeaky wheel received the oil in most group settings. Evidently, in many classrooms or groups, the student was the stimulus to the instructor's behavior in concert with the instructor's perceived expectation for the students. In many classrooms or groups, instruction became a very reactive or responsive activity. Obviously, those of us responsible for instruction need to examine our own perceptions and expectations and take the initiative for our own actions and interactions with others in order to meet the needs of the changing and diverse population of students for whom we are responsible in today's and future classrooms.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep going over and over, but yes, go
Well,
ahead.
no, I just was gonna say, with this whole accountability of teacher evaluation, teacher evaluations are moving away from a teacher-centered classroom to a student-centered classroom.
Exactly.
And the more, strategies that every student responds, whether it's in small groups and, so I think that,
Hasn't happened by accident.
yeah. But I mean, I
Yeah,
think
there's been a
I think
definite
people
movement.
are understanding
Yes.
this issue
Yes.
and moving towards.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you. That's some of the changes that I've seen, especially in teacher education. Yeah, and I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled. And I've seen more social justice issues brought into, and I mean, depending on where you are in the country, but yeah, I thank you for pointing that out because you're right. And if we keep moving in that direction, it will help alleviate some of this.
And I know teachers aren't happy with being evaluated, but if part of the evaluation is moving them towards making sure every student is
Exactly.
involved in the class, then
Exactly.
that's a good thing.
You bet, absolutely.
So your work is paying off.
Well, our work is paying off. Trust me, there's been thousands of people involved. This is not
You know,
our
with that
work.
too, I teach a graduate level course in ESL methods, and so we were having a conversation, and I made some of those teachers mad exactly moving away from this in terms of whole group instruction. I don't care how much you shelter it, is not gonna work for especially those students at the bottom and at the top, language or not, you know? And thinking about, you know, so in order for them to engage, those students need a little what I call front loading, so they're gonna need blah, blah, blah. And so this whole idea from teachers like, where are you gonna get that time? It's like, I get that, I lived that for 23 years, but that whole idea of whole group instruction ain't cutting it for no one,
Which is
or
why,
anybody. You
which
know
is
what I
why
mean?
you're going to see.
And I get resistance from
absolutely,
that,
absolutely.
you know, so, yeah.
You'll notice when you take a look at your bibliography addendum, oops, anyhow, you'll notice that the whole issue of differentiation is, that a lot of the more recent research is dealing with that and getting away from the whole group.
Yeah.
Okay, the last piece that I have up here, instruction, participation, and engagement opportunities need to be initiated, which you just read, are facilitated by the instructor in all classes. But again, becoming more of a facilitator of making sure that all students are involved and differentiating as far as the instruction goes. Okay, now, part of what I encourage you to do is that as you read through these sections, whether it's this unit or the next unit, when you're working here today or after you leave, look through for look for the nuggets, look for the things that resonate with what you're working on and the kinds of things that will resonate with your peers and with your colleagues as you're attempting to share, if you do that, or that you could apply when you go back